Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here for the first part of my 4-part video series of my Best of the Year books. Today I'm talking about Backlist fantasy and science fiction. On Thursday I'm going to be going over Backlist horror and thrillers, and then next week I'll be focusing on the books published in 2020. Now, when I say Backlist titles, I need to point out that yes, a lot of these books are still really new. I'm just saying that any book published before 2020 is technically considered backlist by the industry description. So that's what I'm going with. But like I said, I am very aware that there's a lot of new buzzier books in my list here today. And I have 3 science fiction books and 3 fantasy books. So what I decided to do was I ranked them by genre. I'm going to start with science fiction, going 3, 2, 1 with my favorite, and then start again with fantasy, ending with my favorite book for not only fantasy, but my favorite backlist SFF book overall. And even though these are backlist books, trust me, they are still so worth reading. They deserve the buzz. And if you have not read these ones yet, highly recommend getting on that because I absolutely love all 6 books I'm going to talk about here. And if you want a sneak peek into my horror content and don't want to wait till Thursday, the Books in the Freezer episode of the podcast is dropping today, so it should be available by the time you're watching this. That is the horror book podcast that I co-created with Stephanie. And while I'm no longer an active co-host, I do come back every year for the Best of the Year. And I really enjoyed filming, or rather recording that with Stephanie. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. Again, it's not going to be repetitive of my horror content, but just give you a sneak peek about some of my favorite horror books, but there's definitely going to be variety between the videos and the podcast, so watch and listen to it all. All that being said, let's get into the books themselves. First, let's talk science fiction, and I'm really happy with the 3 entries I have here because while they all technically fall under the sci-fi label, they're all so different from each other. So I really think that even if you're not someone who normally reads science fiction, there's going to be something on here that will appeal to you. And for those of you that say that you don't like sci-fi, I really question whether or not you've just found the right subgenre because, like my list will show, there is so much variety and so many different books that are covered within the genre. And I love all these books, but for very different reasons. So starting at number 3, we have Saturn Run by John Sanford and Katine. And this is a near future sci-fi thriller that is set in a time where NASA discovers that some object is coming towards Saturn, and particularly it is decelerating, which is unusual for a natural object. So that is suggesting that it is possibly an alien object. And so NASA rushes to build a spaceship to go and investigate what is happening at Saturn. And at the same time, we have China also rushing to build their own spacecraft to go as well. And this is just such an engrossing, immersive story. I was just pulled in from page 1 and just loved it. This is just simply a lot of fun. There is a lot of humor, but at the same time, there's a lot of hard science built into this one because the co-author is actually a physics major, and so they made sure that the science is right, or at least plausible, and I really enjoyed that aspect. At the end of the story, you actually get a lot of the science. It takes some time after the story ends to go over the science that was included in the story and just give you a lot more background. And like I said, the story itself is very just enjoyable because you have this thrilling space race of these 2 countries rushing to get to space, and then along the way there are many problems, and so it almost reads like a book like The Martian, where you have to puzzle out and use science to solve their problems, and along the way there are twists and turns. And what I found so compelling is the fact that you as a reader don't know what is at Saturn. Is it an alien? Is it something else? And I love the mystery. I love what they found, and overall it was just such an enjoyable story. If you just want to get pulled into a sci-fi thriller, this is an excellent one to check out. I obviously really enjoyed it because I'm talking about it here and would love more people to read it because in my opinion it's underhyped. I don't hear other booktubers talking about it, and I don't know why because it was so much fun. Now at number 2, we have Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabashek Rice. This is a literary apocalyptic story that is set in northern Canada, specifically on an Indigenous reserve. And in the story, you know that there is some kind of apocalyptic event happening, but the story is told in a really intimate perspective. So basically, we as the readers only know what the Indigenous people on this northern reserve know. And so at the beginning of the story, their cell phones stop working, their internet stops working, and their food supplies just aren't coming. And so they know something is happening, and eventually they do start to get a little more information. But instead of being about the larger events of what is happening around the world, this is really about what happens within a community. And it's a beautiful story that really depicts the reality of life on an Indigenous reserve. And I just thought it was such a fantastic story because it really captured both the beauty, the community, the sense of family and camaraderie, and also in some ways highlights the realities, the challenges of the communities as well. And I thought the writing was fantastic. As I mentioned, this has a more literary quality to it. And I actually do enjoy more literary stories than I like to admit here, particularly when they come from a Canadian perspective. And of course, this is own voices. And I've said before that Indigenous stories really speak closely to my heart. And I just love this one. I thought the characters were so well developed and likable. I cared for them. There were some exciting twists and turns, but overall, I'll say this is a slower story, a slower burn, and I savored every moment. It is the shortest story, and every word, every sentence, every story and event within the story were just so necessary and so perfect. And I just really, really love this one, if you can't tell. And again, while I'm putting this in my science fiction category, it is very light on those aspects. It just has that apocalyptic angle to it. So if you're new to science fiction or don't think you like the genre, this is a perfect one to try out, and hopefully it will win you over. Now, if you've been following my channel closely this year, you might be able to guess, but my number 1 pick for science fiction is the Machineries of Empire trilogy, starting with Nine Fox Gambit, then going on to Raven Stratagem, and then ending with Revenant Gun. And I just love this series. So the short is that this is a military science fiction space opera where there is a commander that decides to bind themselves to the soul of a dead general who was known as being an amazing strategist. And so they take on his expertise, but then they also take on some of his personality. So within this commander's head, she has the mind of this general, and he is possibly a little bit crazy because he was known for winning no matter the odds, no matter what was happening, but he did so often at the risk or detriment of his own people. And the setup for this is so fantastic. And honestly, what I love so much about it was the dead General Jadao, because he is one of the most complex, interesting characters I've ever read. He at times appears to be morally gray, even morally black. There is a humor to this story and to his character that is very subtle at the beginning, and it was just so fascinating. I've got to say that this is also one of the most complex science fiction series I've ever read, and I'll be honest, as much as I love this trilogy, the first book really confused me. I did not understand everything that was happening. Some of the science went over my head. It's based off of geometry and mathematics, and it's definitely a series I need to reread because I didn't pick it up all the first time around. But despite the fact that this was so challenging, and maybe because of it, I loved it so much. And this series went from being a good series when I read the first book, and I fell in love with it when I got to read the second book, Raven Stratagem. This is my favorite of the 3 because this is when the humor really came to life, and this is where the world building really came together in the second book. It was just easier to understand and just a little bit simpler, but at the same time just as good. And the character work again was so compelling. There are some twists and turns, and how you will feel about the characters will change with every book, and it is just so much fun to read. I can't wait to reread it, and just I love it so much, and I adore the world so much that I did go on to read the short story collection. And I normally do not read short stories when it comes to sci-fi. I just don't tend to get into them. I'm not someone that reads the novellas that go along with different series in general, but everyone told me that I had to read this one, and I'm so glad I did. It kind of reads like fan fiction, and by that I actually mean erotic fan fiction, but I don't even mean that in a negative way. Essentially, the author was doing different writing exercises in this world, in this universe, and he compiled them into this collection of stories, and they are so entertaining and at times very sexy and just compelling. There's a fantastic ending that really adds almost an epilogue onto the final book, which is definitely worth reading. And again, so much humor. I love the stories about Shadao. You get to see him growing up, and there's just so many good moments. I cannot believe how much I enjoyed the short story collection because, again, I don't tend to like short stories when it comes to SFF. But this collection proved me wrong. Definitely worth reading. If you love the trilogy and have not gone on to finish this, do so. Trust me, it's worth reading. Now, switching over to fantasy, at number 3, we have the Greenbone Saga, which starts with Jade City and then goes on to Jade War, both of which I read this year and absolutely loved. This is a fantasy series that could be described as urban fantasy, but I will say that it's urban fantasy for those of you that prefer epic fantasy like myself, because the stakes are so high, the magic is amazing, and oh my goodness, it was so good. Essentially, it's set in an alternate world, and an Asian-inspired one, where there are substances called jade that give people magical abilities. It allows them to enhance their powers, and so they still need to train and work on their martial abilities, but the jade allows them to punch harder and just be stronger, better, faster, etc. This substance jade also has a lot of social and political ramifications, and so within the story we actually follow a crime family that has control over the jade in the area, and there are other competing families that are trying to take over. And so it's kind of a turf war, kind of a mafia story, and the magic is very interesting, although it's very subtle. But what really makes the story so good is the characters. The character work is some of the best I have ever read in any series, hands down. The characters are complex, they are morally gray, and they do some terrible things, but at the same time, you can't help but root for them, especially in the second book. I will say that Jade City made me appreciate the series. I liked it, but when I got to Jade War, that is what pushed this series onto my favorites list, because wow, there were some amazing twists and turns, betrayals, character moments, and it's just a series I cannot wait to reread because I'm still thinking about it. I love it so much. And it's just worth reading. Again, even if you don't think you like urban fantasy, because quite frankly, I don't, pick this one up. It is so above and beyond anything else in that subgenre. And oh, I love it so much. I can't wait to continue on with the series. And the martial abilities and fight scenes were fantastic. It's brutal and bloody and violent and unflinching. And if all of that sounds good, then you must pick it up. It's just, oh, it's so good. I'm just gushing at this point, so I better move along. Then at number 2, we have the Dandelion Dynasty, the first book being The Grace of Kings and the second book being The Wall of Storms, both of which, again, I read this year and absolutely loved. This is a Chinese-inspired epic fantasy that is inspired specifically by the Chinese dynasties, and I found this to be incredibly immersive. This story is so epic in scale. It is told from multiple perspectives, and it jumps over time and place, and you get to see the large scope of how this nation has changed. Essentially, it's a story of rebellion. At the beginning of the story, there are several groups that are trying to overthrow the current ruling empire, and from there you have different people that are vying for power, trying to get a step up. A lot of times I've heard this book described as an Asian-inspired Game of Thrones, and I do think that that holds up because there are some fantastic twists and turns. Again, this book is brutal and unflinching, but at the same time it is just so immersive, and it has a really large cast of characters. But despite that, despite following so many different people, I found the characters to be so memorable because the author did a fantastic job of giving everyone really detailed backstories that were just very specific, and the story is just so perfect, honestly. I think that this story will really appeal to any of you that love the TV show Three Kingdoms. It's very much inspired by that. So again, that really epic scale. And my favorite was definitely the first book, The Grace of Kings, was a perfect 5-star read for me. But the second was still very solid. There are some great feminist themes woven throughout these stories with a lot of strong female characters introduced later into the books. So if that's something that is important to you, it is there. And I just love the diversity, the different perspective, the details written into this book. It was just fascinating. And despite being a very long series, I just inhaled and savored every moment, every chapter, every perspective. Again, I really have no criticisms for this series and cannot wait to continue on next year. Now we are finally at the last series on this list. This is my #1 fantasy backlist, but also the #1 backlist SFF I read, period. Hands down, this was a favorite of the year and honestly a favorite of all time. This is probably my #1 favorite fantasy series, period. So all that being said, my #1 pick is the Broken Earth trilogy, the first book, of course, being the 5th season, moving on to the Obelisk Gate, and then finishing out with the Stone Sky. My favorite of the trilogy was the first book, the 5th season, but I really did love the entire thing. I believe I gave them all 5 stars and am just constantly thinking about the series. This, if you're not aware, is considered to be a sci-fi fantasy story. So yes, while I'm putting this in fantasy, other reviewers might actually classify this first and foremost as science fiction. For me, it read more like fantasy, so that's why I'm putting it over here, but it definitely has those elements because this is a post-apocalyptic story. It is told over 3 perspectives following 3 really strong women. And in this world, there is a lot of oppression. People with certain abilities can move rocks and earth. However, they are looked down upon and really treated as lesser. And so this book is very much inspired by the oppression and historical racism that exists within our own world and is taken into a fantasy setting, and it's just done so well. And so this is very much a character-driven story. The emotional gut punch moments in this book hit me so hard. I cared very deeply for the characters and was just so invested in their well-being. I was so worried for them, and the characters certainly do some terrible things, but it's all done for reasons. The story is so purposeful, and that's what I love so much specifically about this first book, is that the author does a really good job of purposely holding the reader back from knowing what is fully going on. And we as a reader know this, but at first, the first time you're reading this, you won't know why. And when it is revealed, when you figure it out, it is so satisfying. And beyond that, it's just a really good series. So even beyond this twist that I'm kind of teasing you, the rest of the series is just wonderful. I love the world building. It is fascinating. Again, bringing in elements of science fiction and the magic and the setting. Everything is just so perfectly done. The writing is excellent. It does take a while to get into a story like this. And I will be honest, this is probably one of the most challenging books I read this year. Challenging in terms of the subject matter, but also the writing and the complexity of the story itself. But again, just like with what I mentioned with my favorite sci-fi series, this worked so well because I had to push myself to read it, and the payoff was so worth it. So I know that this is a booktube darling. Most people have already heard about this series, but if you're one of those people who have not yet read it, highly recommend it. It is so worth your time. Love it so much. I have definitely become a huge fan of N.K. Jemisin's work and look forward to reading more by her because, again, this is a completed trilogy. So I am done with this series, but I will definitely be revisiting it, rereading it. And yeah, just a favorite of all time. Cannot recommend this one enough. All right, so that is it for this video. A couple things before we go. Please leave me a comment down below of the series I mentioned here. Which ones are you most interested in picking up? And let me know what was your favorite backlist, science fiction or fantasy that you read. So anything published before 2020. Also, a reminder to check out my other Best of the Year videos as they become available. They will be linked in the playlist down below and in the cards. And if you want to check out some horror recommendations and don't want to wait till Thursday, you can listen to the podcast episode for Books in Freezer. I will have a link to that. If you're not familiar, I definitely recommend subscribing. Stephanie does a fantastic job giving you bi-weekly horror recommendations, and I'm so proud of the podcast because I did co-create it, so it's kind of my baby too, even if I no longer care for it the way I used to. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, I hope you subscribe. I have more Best of the Year content coming, as I mentioned, and if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. I really appreciate how much my channel has grown this year. You can continue to help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, hitting that notification bell, and sharing this around online. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.